first job in publishing is Barnes and Noble, right?
Actually, I was at a Walden Books.
Oh.
Yeah, I was at a Walden Books for 3 years. Proud to say that our Walden Books was actually doing very well, and it was before they closed down all of the borders. But unfortunately, they tried to negotiate some aspects of our lease with the mall that we were in, and the mall would not budge, and so they decided to close our store. So yeah, actually a handful of us from Walden's ended up at Barnes & Noble, which was in the parking lot of the same mall.
Convenient.
So yeah, I worked at Walden's for 3 years. I worked at Barnes & Noble for 3 years. And funnily enough, without knowing it, whenever I moved to Colorado, I moved to one of the sort of hot spots of publishing. So a friend of mine, when I was working at Barnes & Noble, was like, well, you should look at the Denver Publishing Institute. And I was like, what the heck is that? The Denver Publishing Institute is a intensive month-long crash course in publishing, every aspect of publishing. It's a Monday through Friday throughout the month of July, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. class. They bring in editors, they bring in marketing people, they bring in, at this point, who knows what, because the industry has changed so much, but they do try to bring in somebody who has some sort of experience in just about every facet of publishing that you can imagine. And I had not heard of it. I also did not know that it was one of only a handful of programs like it. So I applied and I got in, and that's how I met Sandra, who I work with now. But immediately out of the Publishing Institute, I got a job as a managing editor working on cookbooks. It was for a small local press. It was a contract position, but I did that for 2 years. And then when my contract was up there, I got a job as an acquisitions editor with another small press, and I did that for 5 years. And then got back in touch with Sandra and said, you know, I'm doing all these things that seem like all the things that I would do as an agent, but I'm working for a publisher, and I would rather work for the authors. And so I started working with her as an assistant and a reader, and then started taking on my own clients. So, yeah.
Why is working as an agent more attractive as a means to working with authors as working as an acquisitions editor?
For me, and this is sort of a little bit of a difference between working for a big house as opposed to a small house. When you work for a small publisher, things are a little less compartmentalized than they are with a big house. And so you get a lot of experience doing things outside of sort of what you would assume is your box. So as an acquisitions editor for that particular company, it was also my job to handle contract negotiations directly with the authors, work with the authors through the entire process with the different departments that they were working with. So the managing editor, the designer, the marketing team, all of those things, I was really, you know, fostering this relationship with this author and holding their hand through the entire project. But when it came down to it, any decisions that had to be made, even if I completely sympathized with the author, I had decided with the publisher because that's who I was working for. And I just, you know, there was nothing wrong with what was going on with the publisher, but it just felt like, you know, I've spent all this time building this relationship with this person, and, you know, if they're not happy with their title, but the publisher says, no, this has to be this way because that's what we want, I have to side with the publisher as opposed to this person that I've spent this amount of time, you know, supporting through this process. And as an agent, I don't have to do that. As an agent, I am the author's, you know, #1 fan. I'm like your person. I'm the person in your corner. I am the person who supports you along the way, but I'm also the person who can be the bad guy if something happens between you and the publisher. One of the easier ways to put it is that I handle the business side of things because publishing is a business. And so it allows the author to, you know, continue focusing on their work and their art and have friendly relationships with their editor and people like that. And then if there's some sort of issue, I'm the one who can step in instead of the author having to do it and straighten things out. And that's where I would rather be, you know. Publishers are out for them.
Straightening out?
Things like, so perfect example, we were talking about the fact that I'm Cajun. There's an author another Cajun author, who once upon a time was talking about the fact that her copy editor kept editing out all of her like Cajun-isms. And so that would be a situation where your agent would step in and say like, no, you can't keep, you know, correcting this, it's supposed to be that way. Or another thing that comes up a lot is cover design. Usually what happens with cover design is that the art department at a publisher will come up with a number of possible designs. The publisher themselves get together and they decide which one they like. And they'll send that to the author, and it's kind of like, here's your cover. And there are a lot of things that can happen in that regard. You know, as an author, you can say things like, well, this looks like a romance cover, and my book is not a romance. I once heard Harlan Coben talking about the redesign of one of his Myron Bolitar covers that had a bullet on the cover. And he said to the publisher, he said, you realize nobody in this book gets shot. So, you know, it's things like that. There are certainly probably more egregious things that would come up, but I would say those are probably the most common things. And two, one of the things to understand as an author when you're working with a publisher is that, you know, hopefully, especially if you have an agent, you're working with someone who loves your book, who thinks that your book is going to do well. And they're not going to do anything to fundamentally change the book, hopefully. But as an author, edits and things like that are always a conversation. So, you know, if you're going through your manuscript and you're going through editorial notes and you agree with half of them and you disagree with half of them, you don't have to say like, oh, no, I really don't agree with half of these notes, but the editor says it has to be that way, and so it does. That's not actually how it works. As the author, you can push back. You can say, well, I don't agree with this edit, and here's why. And the same thing happens, because I happen to be a very editorial agent, the same thing happens as an agent as well. You know, I might have suggestions that the author might say, this doesn't really align with, you know, my vision for the project. It's not my book. I'm the agent, but I am trying to address potential, you know, pitfalls and issues that are going to come out. And so hopefully, if I'm totally off base with an editorial note, or if an editor is totally off base with an editorial note, the author is comfortable enough to say, well, I don't agree with this, and here's why. And then maybe it can become a conversation. So maybe, you know, maybe we don't have to fix it this way, but maybe it does still need to be addressed. And maybe having the conversation has sparked an idea on the author's part of, you know, the perfect way to fix it that works for everybody. But I think that's something that a lot of authors sort of go into the process not really understanding, you know, that once you get an editor, once you get a book deal, you're not committed to every single note and dictation that they make. It's, you know, it's a conversation.
I'm curious because I'm always hearing, well, not always, but I've heard from some literary agents that one thing that they'll do to make sure it's a good fit up front to avoid some of this stuff is talk with the editor, get their vision for the book, have some clear idea. So presumably, if they don't say, we want to change the title, we want to put a hideous bullet on your cover that makes no sense or something like that, would it not be good faith that, oh, those things aren't going to happen?
You would hope, but
I think I'm wrong. Why am I wrong?
Well, okay, so publishing is a business, and a lot of big houses, a lot of people don't seem to understand that with a lot of the big houses, these people are working on so many projects at once. You know, for example, editors, an acquisitions editor. When I pitch a project to an editor, they're not sitting in their office reading queries all day. They're probably reading that query, you know, on their way home on the subway, or, you know, they're doing that on their own time. What they're doing in their actual office hours is working with projects that they've already signed and authors that they've already signed. So by the time it goes to, you know, a copy editor, for example, that's not the person who acquired and fought for your book in front of the editorial board that's a copy editor who works for the publisher. So conversations you had with your acquisitions editor, you know, as far as Cajun slang and things like that, may not get passed on to the copy editor themselves, and so they're going to try and fix all that. At the same time, by the time your book goes off to the art director, you know, for cover design, they aren't necessarily reading the book themselves. They're getting notes and they're getting suggestions and they're building a cover based on that. So, you know, the person who put the bullet on the cover doesn't necessarily know that nobody got shot in the book. They're just going off of like, okay, like this is the art direction. These are the other covers that they want me to use as an example. And this is the style and the tone that they're aiming for. And this is what I came up with. You know what I mean?
Somebody doesn't say, Mr. Coben, what do you think would be the ideal cover for this? And then approximately that.
You know, they might. They certainly might at this point, but I can tell you from working for a small press, there are certain things that you as the author don't want to have a hand in. So one of the things that's given me a nice perspective as an agent was the press that I worked for would frequently send me back to authors to ask them to take a stab at their cover blurb, you know, the description of the book. And I can't tell you, 9 times out of 10, it was completely unusable. And that's not because the author was a bad author by any means. It's just because I know from that job and now from working as an agent that authors have a really hard time summing up their book into, you know, one paragraph. And so that experience has given me, like I said, it's given me a nice perspective because now as an agent, so here's a little query tip. When you're querying agents, make sure that you're following the instructions. Our agency has always asked for a query and your first 5 pages. Occasionally we'll get somebody who only sends their query. And that's, you've got 2 opportunities with me. You've got your query that will hopefully catch my attention and hopefully I love what it's about, or what you say your book is about. And then I can dive into the writing and actually see, you know, some of the story, which hopefully will hook me and ask me, you know, get me to the point where I want to ask to see more. But knowing that many authors really struggle with writing that 1 paragraph description, which also translates into authors struggling with their query, like I said, has given me a perspective. So if I read a bad query, I don't hold it against the author. I'm really looking to jump into the actual book itself and see what the writing looks like there, because I know that it's hard, and I know that the query, I always tell authors too, I'm like, you know, don't stress so much over your query. Like, you want it to be like your best foot forward, but I know that it's hard, and hopefully the book itself will show me, you know, your talent as a writer. So yeah, you get like sort of a 2-prong, like this is your first impression. The query is your first impression, but you know, if you stumble on the way out the gate, I'm not gonna hold it against you. I actually want to see the writing.